Like in be like in high school, where you spend the class period actually doing the work that you got to turn in the next day. That's how it was for me. So, all right, good to see everybody out this evening. We're going to kick off our Bible study here in just a few moments, but before we do, I want to open up with a word of prayer. I'm going to ask Brooks, if he will, to ask God's blessing on us. Learn as much as we can tonight, and Mr. Luke and Mr. Zach has prepared for us, and for them to have a ready remembrance of what they prepared for us. Okay. I hope these kind of things don't put too much pressure on anybody. This is not at all my intention. Okay, well, before I talk about the handout that I've given, let's go ahead and start with a review of the 17 time periods. Luke's got them up there. I don't have them up there. I wasn't going to put them up there, but hey, we can roll with it. I was just going to.
Well, it's just on my screen. They can't see them yet.
All right. Why don't we try to do it blind and see how that goes? So Luke's going to help me. I'll be the first to admit I'm not all that proficient. I'm still learning. So if I mess up, you guys just keep on rolling with what needs to be said. All right. Before the flood, scattering of the people, patriarchs, the Exodus from Egypt, wandering in the wilderness,
invasion and
conquest, Judges, United Kingdom, Divided Kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, letters to the Christians. All right, y'all did pretty good. I didn't do so great, obviously there. Okay, we'll keep working on those. As you know, much of Cycle 2 has been, our focus has been to lay just kind of a foundation of the major events in each time period. That's why we began, each and every time period with kind of a review leading up to where we're going to study tonight. We're going to be looking at the invasion and conquest tonight, but we do want to do as we have done and kind of review the major events leading up to this particular time period. This is a big part of what Cycle 2 is about. Thus, the handout, I made that to help us kind of work on memorizing some of the major events. Rick, do we have any more of those, or do we run out? Okay, all right. Is there anybody that didn't get one? If you'd raise your hand. Maybe a husband and wife would be willing to share with somebody that didn't get one. So
we can make some more at the end as well.
Okay.
As Zach's talking about this, so much of what we're doing in Cycle 2 is about building the structure of understanding the outline of the Bible. Cycle 3 is where we really start filling all the gaps in. But we really just want to be able to tell the story and get the big 30,000-foot view for now. And we'll get a little zoomed in as we get to Cycle 3.
Rick, would you replace my pointer batteries, please? It was buzzing at me and said low battery, see?
Sure it is.
It's eating through them. So in the meantime, I'll just PowerPoint to Luke, and he'll advance for me. So, all right. These were really intended, just to kind of help us go through these together as a class. And then if you want to take this home, I just tried to leave one word blank. What I'm thinking we'll do as we progress is I'll just subtract words, and we'll continue to use this as our reference for review. And as we subtract the words, then that'll just cement the ones further in our mind. And maybe we go home and we look at this and find out, okay, this is the section that I need to work on. So early on, it's simple, but it gets more and more complicated, especially when you get to the Exodus. You have more and more events occurring. So the idea being is, when we think about a certain time period, we can recall the key events that are all there. And so much of Cycle 2 is really laying the foundation for the major events, and then, as Luke mentioned, diving into some of the specifics in Cycle 3. So if you just want to go ahead and advance us through those, we're going to be starting this front and back. So looking at the before the flood, we're just, by the way, this is coming from, as has been observed, the 3-cycle book, pages, starting with page 19. You've got these events and just bullet point. That's straight where I took the handout from. The handout is going to help us to follow along. Are those not going to advance one at a time?
No.
Okay. All right.
I think the next ones will.
Okay. We'll tell you what, we'll back up and just do a quick recap.
Okay.
As if I think we're probably pretty solid on this. In the beginning, chapter 1. Thank you. We have the creation of the world, and then Adam and Eve in the garden. The first sin in Genesis chapter 3, where Eve takes from the forbidden fruit, and then you have the curse that results from that, and Adam and Eve being evicted from the garden. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel, and the event that happens there. And then chapter 5 is the generations. that's the linking story that's going to set us up for the next account as it introduces us to Noah. All right, I think if we'll have these pop up one at a time. All right, so the first event of the flood is what? Okay, the flood itself. After that, okay, meat given for food. Up to that point, it seems like all they ate were vegetables, so definitely a good day in mankind's history right there. All right, after that, okay, law of capital punishment. Okay, so one of the primary sins that led to the flood was that the earth was filled with violence. Okay, and so mankind being made in the image of God, God sets forth in order to prevent this from happening again. Okay, he says if anyone sheds man's blood, then that person is to be put to death. So the law of capital punishment is set forth by God. After that, you have what? Okay, covenant of the rainbow. That's the sign that God gives Noah and all creation that he'll never destroy the earth with water again. After that, okay, curse on Canaan and well, yes, curse on Canaan. Anybody remember who Canaan was? Yeah, it was one of the sons. It was Ham that you remember. Ham sees his father in his tent uncovered, and he goes and he tells his brothers, and they walk backward and cover up Noah. When Noah awakes, he curses Canaan, Ham's son. So it's kind of an interesting thing as to why he cursed his son whenever Cain seems to be the main perpetrator. You'll just have to wait till cycle 3, and we'll dive into some possibilities. Huh? There's a lot of speculation on that. Some of them thinking that he could have been involved in some sort of a degradation, and you see the cursing of his lineage. And so, I mean, he could have cursed Ham himself, but it seems to be his lineage that he curses and punishes. And one of the curses being, I was going to talk about this tonight when we talked about the invasion conquest, but Mr. Phillip wants to know now, so we'll talk about that right now. One of the curses being that Canaan was going to be a servant, or Ham's descendants were going to be servants to their brothers. Okay, that's significant to the Bible story in that the Canaanites are descended from, that inhabit the land are descended from Canaan, who descended from Ham, who was cursed by Noah, his father. And so what we're going to see happening is not only their eviction, but their enslavement. Okay, and so thus fulfilling the prophecy that Noah made when he said that Ham and his descendants through Canaan were going to be cursed. So that's how that kind of event ties into the major part of the Bible story. And from there we have the generations, which is the next linking story that sets us up for scattering of the people. All right, first event being, all right, Tower of Babel being built. After that, okay, the languages were divided. And then again, so the first 3 linking stories are going to be the generations. So just genealogies to segue to the next section, thus introducing us, Abraham being the emphasis of this third section of genealogies found in Genesis chapter 11. And that takes us to the patriarchs. So those are easy. Somebody rattle them off for me. Yeah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And Joseph being the linking story there. That sets us up. This clicker and me are about to have a fight. Joseph being the one who rescues his family in Egypt, and they dwell there in safety and peace for many years, but that sets up the Exodus period because you have a Pharaoh coming to power that did not know Joseph and did not know what he had done for all of the people. So that leads us to the Exodus, the first one being Israel in bondage. That's where we find them in chapter 1. What's the next event? Okay, Moses' birth. Going to be the primary character over the next several books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And as we're going to see, he's going to emerge as he's called to leadership by God for a specific purpose. After that, okay, raises a son of Pharaoh's daughter. So he's raised up in the Egyptian palaces, in positions of influence and power. After that, number 4, okay, rejected by his people. That's when he goes out and tries to stop a fight between 2 Israelites that were fighting. The only problem is the day before he had killed an Egyptian and hid his body in the sand because he was beating one of the Hebrews, and they kind of turned that around on him. Word starts to spread of what Moses has done, and he is forced to what? to, okay, he flees to Midian, flees to the wilderness. That's actually, I'm trying to stick with the terminology in the book. It is the Midian wilderness that he goes to, but he flees to the wilderness, leaving Egypt behind. From there we've got burning bush. This is Exodus chapter 3, where I believe he sees the bush that doesn't burn up as he's a shepherd. Anybody remember how long he was a shepherd in Midian for? Okay, 40 years. Remember, Moses lives 120 years, very neatly divided into 3 40-year periods. The first 40 years is in Egypt, second 40 years is as a shepherd in Midian, and the third 40 years is leading the people. So from there we have, goes directly into the plagues. Okay, you'll remember at the burning bush he is called by God, go back and deliver my people, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. From there we have the plagues. After that, okay, crossing the Red Sea, and then, okay, trip to Sinai, and the events at Mount Sinai, the covenant that's made, not only that, but the sin that occurs in Exodus chapter 32, where they build and worship the golden calf. So you've got the ratification of the covenant and the violation of the covenant, just bam, bam. All right? After that, okay, they make a trip down to Kadesh there. And then, who's sent into the land of Canaan? Okay. Spies are sent into the land of Canaan, and after that, okay, Israel refuses to go in. And this is the linking story that leads us to the next section. Israel's refusal, lack of faith to go and take the land that God had promised them. Thus, they are forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So also, you may notice the texts that are involved in each section. We want to work on this, but look, I know this is a lot of memory work. So just, maybe have that in your mind as you're working through in these various sections. So the wandering in the wilderness is the text of Numbers 14 through 36, Deuteronomy, and Joshua chapters 1 through 5. All right, let's run through this real quick. First point is, okay, they're sentenced to wander in the wilderness 40 years, 1 year for each day that they were in the land of Canaan. After that, you have the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. What were they challenging? Yeah, the leadership of Moses and Aaron. So they wanted to be involved in the leadership, and that did not go well for them. After that, okay, the Aaron's rod that budded. This was further validation that Aaron was the one that was chosen by God to serve as the priest on behalf of the people. After that, okay, Miriam dies, and then sin of Moses and Aaron. That's where Moses is primarily the one at fault there. That's where I believe the rock is struck rather than spoken to. All right, after that, okay, passing by Edom. Okay, the Edomites were family members with the Israelites through Esau, so they'd be very close relatives. So they're passing by the Edomite region. After that, okay, Aaron's death, and then, okay, fiery serpents. That's because of their complaining. The Lord sends a plague among them. Really neat picture of Jesus there. All right, after that, okay, conquering Sihon and Og. That's the Amorites, and Og of Bashan. Both of those giants. So interesting whenever we cycle back around to look at some of those battles in a little more detail. After that, you've got Balaam, who leads them to fornication with who? Okay, with the Midianites. Okay, so we talked about that last week. This is how the subterfuge he sets forth to lead them into sin. After that, the second census, so the people were numbered again. Slaughter of, okay, the Midianites. So this is God's judgment on them for ensnaring Israel in idolatry. After that, okay, speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Okay, Deuteronomy means second law, so this is the second giving of the law to this new generation. Then you've got Moses' death, crossing of the Jordan, and observing the Passover. Observing the Passover is the linking story that's going to lead us into tonight's study, which is the invasion and conquest. All right, so let me just quickly put up, this is kind of just a map of the area. I'll try to run through just some of the geography real quick and make a couple more observations from Joshua and then hand it over to Luke. He's going to get to talk about the fun part of the book of Joshua tonight, that is the three campaigns that the children of Israel make upon the land of Canaan. Okay, I'd mentioned earlier the land of Canaan was called exactly that, Canaan, because of the inhabitants, that is, the Canaanites. And that, remember, that goes back to Noah's son Ham, and he was the one that was cursed because of his father's sin and his possible involvement in all of that. The curse being they were going to be servants to his brothers. Okay, and so this is how we're going to see the promise fulfilled. So a little bit about Canaan. We're going to be talking a lot about this, and I wish we had more time to spend on that, but maybe we'll delve a little more detail about the geography and the land itself whenever we cycle back around. But let me just give you a couple of things as a flyby overview. So the land of Canaan is about 12,000 square miles. So to put that in perspective of us, it's about a quarter the size of the state of Alabama. So not a very big piece of land. But if you think about, this is where God does the majority of the redemptive history for all of the world. And you think about how big just a slice of Alabama is, that's where the majority of the Bible takes place, okay, in a very small area. Its northmost city is Dan, its southmost city is Beersheba, and that was about 150 miles. So if you travel from far north Israel to far south Israel, you're covering about 150 miles from top to bottom. Three major bodies of water. Let me see if I got a pointer here. All right. You've got the Sea of Chinnereth. That's how it's referred to in the Old Testament, more commonly known as the Sea of Galilee to us, or Gennesaret, and I think in Luke's Gospel. You've got the Jordan River itself. Interestingly, let's see, should have Mount Hermon somewhere up here at the top, right there. Okay. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the bodies of water. It's interesting to track the Jordan River down from its north to its very end where it flows into the Dead Sea, but not going to do that. Okay, it gets most of its water from Mount Hermon there, and it begins traveling south, and it feeds into the Sea of Galilee, and then it travels further south, where it feeds again into the Dead Sea. Okay, and that's really where it ends. And so those are three significant bodies of water: Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, and the Dead Sea itself. In Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 1, you find out the inhabitants of the land are the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And what were the children of Israel commanded to do with them? Okay, destroy them. There are certain people that they were told, go and send a message of peace, and if they'll make peace, then have peace with them. If not, then then you may engage in holy warfare with them. But there were some they were commanded, do not make peace with. And Luke's actually going to get to talk about one of those tonight, that things didn't go according to plan. Some of the neighboring nations, you have Tyre and Sidon up north of Israel. You have the Philistines, and we know their significance as enemies of God's people during the days of the United Kingdom. Then you've got the Amalekites that are down there. These are all unrelated. As far as nations that are related to the children of Israel, you've got the Edomites a little bit southeast, Moabites, and the Amorites who Moses fights and destroys. But you've also got the Ammonites there. Ammon and Moab both descended from Lot, so they're related to God's people. God tells them, I've given them their land, you don't take it. But the rest they were to take for themselves. So that's just a very brief comment about the neighboring nations. I'm just going to bust through this last one so Luke can have the time that he needs. Joshua, as we know, is appointed as the new leader to take Moses' place after he dies. The first thing he does in chapter 2 is he sends spies into the land of Canaan. Questionable call considering how that worked out last time, but he handles it a little differently than Moses did. From there, Israel crosses the Jordan River, so they enter into the land of Canaan. Memorial stones are gathered as they cross the river and set up for the people to teach future generations, what are these stones for? And they're going to tell them the Lord opened up the Jordan River and allowed us to cross on dry land. And so they're continuing to still tell the story of God's redemption. In chapter 5, three major events occur. You've got this new generation that's circumcised. First off, just think of the statement that's making, because we know what happens. Go back to the book of Genesis. You had that very instance with Levi and Simeon where they make peace with the men of Shechem, and if they're circumcised, they go in the next day after they're recovering from that procedure and kill them all. So think of how vulnerable the army would be but they're doing that on the other side of the Jordan. So that's the statement that they're making as they're preparing to enter in. Not only that, but this is the sign of the covenant of the people of God. You have the first Passover there observed, and then as Joshua is beginning to travel throughout the land, you have him encountering the commander of the Lord's army. And this is what exactly God said is, I'm going to go before you. God's going to fight on their behalf. And so, unsurprisingly, it's not in the strength of Joshua that they're going in, but the one whom God has appointed to go before them. So, with that being said, Luke's going to take over and talk a little bit about the conquest itself.
Before we leave chapter 5, did a lot of listening and reading and studying about the things going on in chapter 5 because it's so important. It is a pivotal chapter in the two, going from the end of the wandering into the invasion and conquest. Verse 9 in chapter 5 says, Then Yahweh said to Joshua, Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day, which Gilgal means to roll away. And the idea of a reproach, the entire wandering in the wilderness was a reproach. It only had to happen because they rejected God at the end of the Exodus, right? If they would have accepted that. And so the entirety of the wandering that we've just studied, this 40 years. Now, that we're in chapter 5, they observed the Passover. That is the 41st Passover. You had the original, and now we're 41 years from there. And with that, they're renewing the covenant and being reminded of the law. Also, the point with circumcision. There's several things to consider with circumcision. Verses 5 through 7 deal with it specifically. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. That also was a reproach to the people. Because the covenant, Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, was very specific, that they were to circumcise their newborns on the 8th day. And so the rolling back of the reproach that takes place here in Joshua 5 is extremely significant. It's the generation is no longer, now we are with this new generation, the renewed loyalty to God. And so now we're getting into the promised land. The promises are now back on track to be fulfilled. And so it's a very significant chapter, and hopefully it'll be one that we can remember as a very pivotal moment in the history of the people.
Hey, Luke, just a reminder, as to the seriousness of not circumcising your children, remember Moses, when he didn't circumcise his son, as he's going back to Egypt, God meets him, and he hadn't circumcised his son, and he's ready to kill him. And Zipporah does it and spares Moses his life. But he talks about rolling away the reproach. That's how serious that was, their failure to do that. If they didn't circumcise their sons, I mean, it could cost them their life. And so it was a very significant event, and it also speaks to the faithlessness of the previous generation, that they didn't do that. They have to do this after they cross, this new generation crosses the Jordan River and prepares to take the land God promised.
And so just the symbolism and the significance of the things that are going on here are very pertinent to us in understanding. So as we enter into the campaigns and enter into the land, it's divided into the 3 sections, and we'll take our time to talk through these. But the first being the central campaign, as they have just gone across the Jordan River. Now, Brother Waldron in his book does not include the conquering of Jericho, per se, in the central campaign. That's almost like just the chapter or 2 before where he puts the divisions of these campaigns. So let's just talk about Jericho for a moment. What was Jericho? A walled city. Anybody in your reading see how large of a city it was? 7 acres. The city of Jericho was 7 acres. It's not very large. I bet some of y'all own more than 7 acres. Your house place is more than 7 acres. I know Billy and Leslie's have got more than that. But that's where the city was, and that's where the debris and the rubble and all the remains of that was. And so when we start thinking about them being able to walk around it, well, that's a lot more feasible. We're not talking about walking around Birmingham. We're talking about a 7-acre plot. And so it just makes it more realistic in the command for them to obey. And so we see them fulfilling God's commands there at the taking of Jericho, marching around, the walls fall. What one significant person do we remember from Jericho? Rahab. Why do we remember her? She's in David's lineage, Christ's lineage. Yes, that's pertinent. She hid the spies. So who were the spies? What did they do? They scouted out Jericho. They went in and checked things out, came back, gave a report, and they saw that they were going to be faithful to God and obey God. Now, they used the normal tactics of taking a city, right? No. Once a day, march around the city once a day. How were they to march around it? Silently. Let that weigh on you for a minute. That'd be it. I don't know. They would be an impressive sight where in silence they march all the way around us. What are they doing? Can you imagine the emotion that the people inside the walls would have felt? Because with that many people, we're only talking about 7 acres. You couldn't get to the end of it before they were fully encircled. So the significance of taking Jericho. We see that Jericho was taken, the walls fell, and what were they told to do with the things there in the city once the walls had fallen? Destroy it all. It was dedicated to God. They weren't to touch it. They weren't to have it. They weren't to take it. It was the first fruits. But we know that wasn't the case, right? Anybody remind us who broke that? Achan. What did it cost him? His life, his family's life, because he disobeyed God. Have we seen enough history now throughout the Bible story that when you rebel against God, it equals death? From the wandering in the wilderness, we know the census, we know the mixed multitude that came out. The consequences of disobedience to God are severe. Crawford? Absolutely. And because of that, it had to be purged out. It could not be tolerated. And that's why we see the death of Achan and his family as a consequence. All right. From there, that was Jericho. We had Bethel. What happened at Bethel? Did it go smoothly at Bethel? Did they take it at the first shot? What happened? They didn't. They went the first time. Yeah, that was kind of the catalyst that caused that with Achan, because they weren't able to conquer. They ultimately were able to. And then, I'm sorry.
That was Ai.
Ai. I said the wrong city. I saw some funny faces. Ai, not Bethel. Sorry. Got them out of order on my overhead. So Ai, yes. And then finally, Joshua chapter 8, Ai was given to them. Y'all, it's okay to correct me. I make mistakes too. So Ai was given after they had been defeated the first time. In a more conventional manner. Yeah, this was not silently marching around and the walls falling down. And so we see that with Ai. And then we get into chapter 8. Let me not skip over the claim of Shechem there at the end of chapter 8. Because we get into the scene there with Ebal and Gerizim, right? We see the claiming of the land there, verses 30 through 35 or so. And so we have the offering that is made there. In chapter 9, we get into the treaty with the Gibeonites. And this is something that Zach was mentioning a moment ago. Who are the Gibeonites?
One of the inhabitants they were to destroy.
Yeah, they were residents of Canaan. Who do the Gibeonites portray themselves to be? Foreigners. What are some of the things that they did to make it look as if they had come from a long way? Moldy bread, worn wineskins, torn wineskins, raggedy clothes. They made themselves look poor, almost to the point of destitute, and that they were just foreigners, strangers from a faraway land. And what did the children of Israel do? They made a treaty. Were they supposed to have made a treaty? No.
And that's an interesting statement. It said Joshua didn't consult the Lord when he made the treaty. So
that's right.
That just jumps out at you in that text.
Without consulting God, God probably would have revealed to them that they are not who they said they are, but they didn't ask.
Yeah.
And because of that, there were issues from there. What happened to the Gibeonites? Wood bearers and water toters in the service of the temple, or ultimately the temple with the tabernacle. They were put under manual labor. Interestingly enough, throughout history, you see as it fast forwards, the Gibeonites became a respectable people among the children of Israel, but it didn't start in a good way.
I think it's interesting to compare the stories of Rahab and the story of the Gibeonites, because you've got similar instances. You've got two people that fear the Lord. Okay, so they had that much going for them, and they act in faith. I mean, yes, it was underhanded. Yes, it was deceptive, and against what we would know to be conventional measures and expectation and morals under the new law, but they only knew one thing about God. They didn't want to mess with Him. And so you see their faith emerging, and you see the blessing that comes upon them. As Luke pointed out, you follow them into the latter period of time, and there are people that are there right alongside God's people when they're coming back from captivity and rebuilding the temple. They're involved in that. Al in the back.
Yes, sir. Brother Al?
Divide the country. That's exactly what God told Israel to do. Divide it, then go south and go north. Don't hit all at once. Now, these people were bands, I understand, but still, that's the way to attack.
Right. The divide and conquer, which we see happening just as God led them. So we have the treaty there. Then the second portion of the southern campaign, we have the fight with the kings of the south. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 3, it mentions Adonizedek, Hoham, Piram, Japhia, Deber, all those that are mentioned there. And so they came up against those and fought against those. And what happened in that fight? They win or lose?
Israel won.
They won. Yeah, Joshua led them to victory. Now, they did not run them completely out of the land, but they were able to conquer those cities and conquer those people. But what was God's command? Destroy them all. Utterly destroy them. You want to use the words that he uses later with the Amalekites and King Saul. So we see that going on. So we have the 5 kings in the south, in the southern campaign, and then they turn and go to the north, and they fight the kings of the north, most notably led by Jabin and Hazer. Now, Jabin's the king, Hazer's the city. What did they do to that city? It was almost the capital of the north kingdoms, the most notable. Anybody remember what they did to Hazer? They burned it. Was that their normal operating procedure? No, it was not. I see some heads shaking. No, that's not what they normally did. They did not normally burn the cities. Why did they not normally burn the cities? There's a reason. They took them over. God promised that you will live in cities that you did not build and eat from vineyards that you did not plant. This was a unique situation that Hazer was burned. This was not the normal. Hazer, being the capital of the north, is up on a very high mountain from one of Brother Waldron's lectures that I listened to. And they have today a bronze statue silhouette of a warrior there that you can see from a long way away. And he said the first time that he ever went there, he just thought about how far that the people there in Hazor would have been able to see them coming, because it's up and it's up and it's up and it's up to get to the city of Hazor. But God was with them, and it was one of the most northern cities, which also would have served as a sign to anyone coming from the north of the type of people that the Israelites had become, and the power that they had, and the power that God had granted them. So we see that there in the northern campaign. Talked about those. Couple things to note from the map. Can I mark this for the pointer?
Yep.
We talk about the two mountains that they went upon. Anybody remember them by name? Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Which one was good for blessings and which ones were cursings?
Ebal was curses, Gerizim was blessing.
Yep, Ebal cursings, Gerizim there. A modern picture of that, Ebal, Gerizim, and Shechem is right there between. And so there, as I read earlier, what chapter was that? Chapter 8, verses 30 through 35. That's what it's talking about. That's where they were at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, just as Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had given a command at first to bless the people of Israel. And so we have this, the burnt offerings that are offered there. And so claiming the land and giving the decrees that are told here. At the end of this, we talked about the northern campaign, the southern campaign. We have a list of summaries of the victories of the kings there in chapter 11. One thing that's different, when we think of a kingdom, we usually think of a larger expanse than what would have been the play in the time of that. Each city essentially had their own king. And so we might call it a governor, but there was no unifying federal government or state government at this time. These are just tribes. These are just clans of people. And so that's how this functioned. And that's how things like the empires to come, as we'll talk about in the Old Testament, that they were able to overthrow and to have world domination because they were a much larger force just coming against these smaller clans throughout. I think that's probably good enough for that.
All right. The first 12 chapters of Joshua are interesting, but then you get to some of the more challenging chapters, and this is the division of the land. But yet this is a very significant story. So there's all kind of maps out there. This one was clear. I felt like it would help us be able to kind of see how the land was allotted. So each individual tribe receives a section of the land. I mean, just looking at it, there's a couple observations that you would make. One observation is that Manasseh received a pretty good chunk of land. Joseph had two sons, remember, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he received a birthright. And so we see Manasseh geographically being one of the largest tribes, Ephraim being one of the primary tribes as well. They were a tribe of warriors, but they were there kind of centrally located. So positionally, you look at, some of the others, Asher, Naphtali, the north, and Reuben's over there on the east of the Jordan, and so they're positioned centrally in a pretty good spot. You'll also notice
one point to make: the land of Canaan, the promised land, is generally, I think we can say pretty conclusively, is the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. The stuff to the east was not necessarily considered part of the promised land. That's why you can say that Moses never entered the promised land. He looked across the Jordan River into the promised land. And so we see Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, they wanted to stay there. Sometimes we'll call those the Transjordanic tribes, but they just wanted the extra space. But that was not truly the promised land. The promised land is to the west side of the Jordan River.
That's right. That goes back to Numbers chapter 32, where Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, they go to Moses and say, hey, this is the kind of land we want. So it was good for raising cattle and those sort of things. And they said, we want to receive our inheritance on this side. So as Luke pointed out, it was God's intention. The promised land was west of the Jordan, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, but they wanted the land on the east side. Consequently, Moses gave them that land. That's the reason they inherited on the east side of the Jordan, where the Amorites were, Og and Bashan. So that's just a picture there of the map. You may also notice that Simeon's there in the midst of Judah. Later on, it kind of gets just absorbed, and Judah becomes the primary tribe down in south. So, I mean, you've got Israel to the north and Judah to the south. This was part of the foretold by Jacob. Simeon and Levi, it said both of those people were going to be scattered throughout the land of Israel. Genesis 49. The Simeonites were absorbed essentially by Judah. The Levites were scattered all throughout the land. That goes back to their violent acts against Shechem and his family. But that's just a real quick map of how the various tribes, where they received their inheritance at. Then you get to Joshua 23 and 24. Those are a pretty good section. You got Joshua talking to, after the land is divided, you've got a few events going on there. In chapter 20, you've got the establishment, or the allocation, rather, of the cities of refuge. 3 on the east side of the Jordan, 3 on the west side. This is where, if you accidentally took someone's life, you could flee to that place, and you could find refuge there as long as you stayed within that city during the life of the current high priest. After he died, you were free to go, but you had to stay in that city. Otherwise, the avenger of blood could come looking for you and could take your life, because even though the death was accidental, in retaliation for the loss of their kinsman. Chapter 21, you've got cities that were given to the Levites, so they're scattered all throughout the land. They'll be able to perform religious services for God's people, and so they're kind of placed all throughout the area. And then in chapter 22, after most of the land is conquered, the eastern tribes return home. And so those are the Transjordanic tribes that Luke was referring to. Ephraim, Gad, half of Manasseh, they cross and they go back to receive their inheritance.
Before we leave chapter 22, it has an interesting story in the back half there of chapter 22 about the look-alike altar, the faux altar that they established. Yep. And it was almost the first line of friction between the two sides of the Jordan River, because they built this large altar, and those on the west side thought, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. That's idolatrous. You're already going after other gods. But that was not their purpose. They used it as a memorial that we are your brethren, and that we know that we serve the same God, that we are fellow heirs with God.
Yep. So they were able to come to peace whenever they all were on the same page, understanding the purpose of that altar. I mean, chapter 23, you've got Joshua, his charge to the leaders of Israel. Too important to pass up. A big section of much of the religious world today is still looking for Israel to receive the land that God had promised them. They don't believe that that's been fulfilled. And we see in Joshua chapter 23, as he's speaking to the elders, he says, this is an important passage that helps us understand, okay, the land promise was fulfilled. We shouldn't be looking for Israel to be given the land that God promised them. Joshua tells the elders, not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you. So God's promises had been fulfilled. His promise to give the people the land that he told Abraham his people were going to have, that's been fulfilled. This has occurred. God's people received the land that was promised to them. And so that kind of ties into premillennialism and this idea of literal Israel receiving the land that God promised them thousands of years ago. Joshua says that promise has been fulfilled. So that's just a significant passage to take note of. So he makes the charge to the leaders of Israel, and then he charges the nation in chapter 24, the capstone passage being verse 15, choose you this day whom you're going to serve. From there, Joshua dies, and he's buried in the hill country of Ephraim, which is where he received his inheritance. Joseph's bones were buried. He was brought back from Egypt because he wanted to be laid to rest in the promised land. And then Eleazar dies. That was high priest at the time. The significance being the leadership of the invasion and conquest of the land is passing on. So you've got this baton being handed to this next generation. And that's really the linking story that leads up to that. Judges chapter 2, verse 10, we're told that Joshua dies, the elders die, the high priest dies, and it says there arose a generation that did not know the Lord. And that's going to set the stage for idolatry and judicial punishment from God and Israel crying out for mercy, God sending a judge to deliver and to break the hold of their enemies' power over them. So that's really the linking story that's going to set us up for the next time period.
Joshua 24:14 is the fulfillment of the land promise.
23:14.
Yes, 23:14. I'm sorry, 23:14. All came to pass. Not a word failed of any good thing that the Lord had promised to Israel. All came to pass. Such a significant verse. Brother Al? Sure. That's right. And that's a chant that some of the them will claim today, even in the political stuff of 2025.